everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here once again, and thank you very much to Mark and to ICD for this wonderful opportunity to address and to meet wonderful people here and to discuss some of the current issues and trends in the world today. So I would like to refer just briefly to democracy. And I would just like to share with you some worrying and startling data that might be a good provocation maybe for a debate, because I believe we should focus more on these threats that we are facing right now. Maybe it's not always important to give the answers, but to have the right questions. So just briefly, there's one trend right now in academic circles which is known as democratic recession. And basically this term was coined by the university professor Larry Diamond from Stanford, basically pointing out the regression of democratic institutions, processes, and norms. And basically, the professor is pointing out the failure of many new democracies to constantly deliver their performance in order to achieve development, social peace, and good governance. Since then, there has been a regression of democracies in many influential countries, such as Russia, Venezuela, Nigeria, Thailand, and democracies with a serious deterioration in other large, important countries like Philippines, Bangladesh, and etc. So basically, the professor, Larry Diamond, analyzed really on three indicators. Basically, he's referring to three really important indexes and important surveys that were conducted in the past decade from Economist Intelligence Unit, Freedom House, VDEM Institute in Göteborg, and etc. So, although sometimes the aggregate global trends record moderate democratic deficits since 2006, we might say, with the most significant erosion observed in sub-Saharan Africa, the overall picture appears far more worrying. So basically, for example, in 1901, there were only 11 democracies in the world. By 1920, the number had risen to 20. By 1974, there were 29 democracies in the world. By 1993, it had become 77. And for the first time, a majority of the world countries, basically, in 1997. By 2005, there were 89 democracies, but by 2020, it had fallen to 82. And in the second decade of the 21st century, 1 in 6 democracies are experiencing failures. So basically, according to the scholars, somehow like we are entering in this so-called third reverse wave of democratization, referring to Huntington's wave of democratization, because we know that there were 3 waves of democratization according to him, and also there were 2 reverse waves of democratization where many democratic regimes went back to authoritarian regimes. So according to many scholars, we are entering in so-called third reverse wave. Let's see why. Because in every January, reports from previous years are being published, as we mentioned previously, the same reports that Professor Larry Diamond is referring to from Economist Intelligence Unit, from Freedom House, VDEM Institute in Göteborg. So the most relevant and influential compiles in such reports are global indicators and indexes for democracy. So according to some of them, we can see some worrying data. The indexes and reports cite several reasons for the continued trend of declining trust in democracy and the decreasing number of democracies worldwide. And this trend, which has lasted for more than 15 years, is often termed as democratic recession, not only by Professor Larry Diamond, but also by these relevant sources. So specific challenges mentioned include the consequences of the global economic recession that began late 2007, the newly anticipated global economic recession, the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, climate changes, and also the wars, especially the war in Ukraine. So the general conclusion of all annual reports and democracy indexes from 2023, the most recent one, is that the world is becoming less democratic. Democracy is declining everywhere, while autocracy is on the rise. Globally, the numbers of countries moving towards authoritarianism has been twice as large as the number of countries moving towards democracy over the past 6 years. Civil liberties and the rule of law are deterring, and authoritarian governments are becoming more oppressive. So let's just see some data. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, Democracy Index for 2023, 7.8% of the world population lives in so-called full democracies, meaning that we have full democracies only 24 countries in the world. And it's really interesting that United States since 2017 is not being classified as full democracy, it's being classified as flawed democracy. 37.6% of the population, or 50 countries, live in flawed democracy, 15.2% in hybrid regimes, or 50 countries, and 1/3 of the world, or 39%, specifically in 59 countries, they're living in authoritarian regimes. So with this economist intelligence unit metric is conducted through 5 categories: electoral process, pluralism, governing functionality, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties. Although there have been a trend of deterioration in all 5 categories since 2008, the most pronounced and worrying decline is in the civil rights and electoral processes and pluralism. Just briefly, according to Freedom House, 2024 report, only 20% of the world population has access to political freedoms and rights. The past 18 years have been marked by consecutive democratic regression. Almost everywhere, the decline in political freedoms and rights has caused the attacks on pluralism. Overall, 52 countries recorded a decline, while only 21 countries made progress, which is basically the lowest in the last 18 years. It can be concluded that there is a serious erosion in trust in the institution, in the democratic institutions. For instance, in the oldest modern democracy, the United States, according to the Gallup survey from this year, only 26% of Americans have a high level of trust in 14 major US institutions, which is the lowest ever recorded. The 3 branches of government show a further decline in trust compared to 2021 and a record low within the last 4 decades. Trust in US presidents is 26, 50% lower than 2021. Trust in Supreme Court is 25, while only 7% trust the work of the US Congress. And a similar situation can be observed in Europe as well, especially in the European Union, where a survey of 200,000 people from 2020 to 2023 indicates a decline in trust in EU and institutions. The COVID-19 pandemic brought restrictions on political and civil rights in many countries. In many countries, such measures are used for increased repression and sophisticated digital surveillance over the population. So the politics of fear, led by polarization, discrimination, marginalization, and xenophobia. Institutional weakness and declined trust in social conventions, control and balance are widespread. So the very concept of truth is under attack. So basically, one more report at the end is the report and also the policy papers that were published by the Oxfam Institute, the prestigious Oxfam Institute, and startling data can be read. So, for example, since 2020, from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the richest 1% have claimed almost 2/3 of their new wealth, double the amount of money compared to the 99% of the world population. Billionaires' wealth is increased by 2.7 billion daily, even as inflation surpassed the wages at least 1.7 billion workers. Food and energy companies have doubled their profits in 2022, paying out to 257 billion to wealth shareholders, while 800 million people go to bed all over the world hungry. Only 4 cents of every dollar to tax revenue comes from wealth tax, and half of the world billionaires live in countries where there is no inheritance tax on the money that they give to their children. A 5% tax on the world multimillionaires and billionaires could raise $1.7 trillion annually, enough to lift 2 billion people out of poverty and fund a global plan to eradicate hunger. Extreme growth in social inequality occurred during the pandemic. The richest 1% took 63% of their new wealth, more than 26 trillion from 2020 to 2022. The top 9% below them received 27 of the new wealth, or 11 trillions, leaving only 10%, or about 5 trillion, for the remaining 90%, or 7.2 billion people. Most governments in the world, or 95%, did not increase taxes on the wealthy. Instead, some even reduced taxes on wealthy individuals and corporations. So that leads us to the fact that fewer people believe that democracy really can respond to such crises and challenges. And the question is why? Because another worrying statistic is the absence of young people in democratic institutions, for example. Although 50% of the world population is under 30 years old, only 2.6% of the members of the parliaments worldwide are from this age group. Women, although making up to 50% of the population, are represented in the institutions in the parliament only by 26.4%. So the democratic public demands policy changes that will give them hope for better future are being expected. If this is not fulfilled, their demand can turn into pressure for regime change and shift towards populism and authoritarianism, and also lead to these problems of democratic recession. So the Center for the Future of Democracy at the University of Cambridge, in their study, highlights that trust in democracy is decreasing because democratic institutions have failed to address some of the major crises of our time, noting that the rise of growth of populism is more than a symptom than a cause of democratic recession. So basically, they're referring also to the idea that the revolt is not towards the concept of democracy, but mostly to the elites. It can be said that the future of democracy depends on many factors, and there are no unique solutions. Therefore, it is necessary to focus on promoting inclusive and responsible democratic processes, protecting citizens' rights, and fighting against authoritarianism, as well as promoting international cooperation among democratic countries. These efforts should be embedded in the broader context of social, economic, and environmental sustainability, as democracy cannot be consolidated in conditions of social and economic inequality and environmental crisis. It should be kept in mind that the democracy is not a permanent or a static state, but in constantly moving and process of change and improvement. Thus, it is important to evaluate and develop the democratic system in line with the needs and challenges of our time, so that we can protect and improve it as states and as global community. And recently, I read a paper in Economist that says, forget about democracy, let's speak about freedom and human rights. So basically, the perception is, and the lesson is that the world politics will need a strong sense of public welfare because democracy alone is not enough, and basically it should be related to each of our individual efforts. So I thought that just throw some provocations and some data that might be a good opportunity for debate. So thank you so much for your patience, and thank you so much for being here.